Welcome back. Time for another dose of space physics. Like always, we will deal with electromagnetic fields, plasma currents, geomagnetism, and space weather activities. My goal is to explain the interactions between environments in space and on Earth, weather and space weather. Of course, I am absolutely aware that according to the mainstream science, heliophysics and meteorology have absolutely nothing in common. And if there's in fact any correlation between magnetic fields in space and air currents in atmosphere, it's a completely marginal factor, and there is no need to include it in our current models. Environments in space and on Earth are shaped by completely different forces, so how can they be somehow correlated? However, I never cared too much about mainstream science. Researching those things is for me nothing else than a hobby. I don't have any scientific career, so I don't risk anything by making claims which might be considered as pseudoscience by actual and professional scientists. I started to research space weather around 4 years ago without any proper education in this field. All I did was to gather all kinds of data, observe and connect the dots in a way which would make sense for me. And today, after 4 years of my research, I can finally assure you that almost everything what I will say in this movie regarding heliophysics and space weather will be in 100% scientifically valid. It's probably the first time I made such statement in my movie. Until now, I was always telling you that I can't be sure if I didn't make any mistake in my explanations. Well, it seems that I gained enough experience points to advance to a new level. Where are the free Pokeballs? I came to the point where I can prove scientifically that my model is absolutely correct according to officially approved knowledge. In this movie I will make a summary of everything what I explained in my last 2 lessons. I'm aware that things which I've discussed lately were well above the understanding for a common viewer. This is why now I will try to explain my model in an easier way. Let's begin from the officially approved science, which shows that my model is completely valid according to our current knowledge. As I said in previous movies, it is well known that there is a direct connection between geomagnetic field and atmospheric pressure, although I would say that isobars of surface pressure closely follow geomagnetic field lines, and not the other way, as it is written here. This publication shows that fluctuations of interplanetary magnetic field, IMF, affects directly the surface pressure in mid-latitudes. IMF BY component seems to be the main factor in this process. This image explains this interaction using the electric potentials in the ionosphere. In my last movie, I spent quite a lot of time discussing this subject. Last time, I also discussed this paper, which shows that crossing between sectors of IMF affects the atmospheric vorticity. Vorticity seems to be weakening during the crossing of a sector boundary and in the following hours. This is the graph of this correlation. And now something new. I didn't manage to speak about this publication in my last movie, as my brain cells were rather exhausted after a serious workout. From this paper we can learn that there is a possible correlation between interplanetary electric field IEF and the cloud cover. This image shows that cloud cover seems to be strongly affected by positive electric field, while negative currents cause only a minimal effect. However, I think that there is a significant mistake in this publication. According to this paper, direction of electric current depends on the orientation of IMF BZ component. Southward oriented IMF negative BZ supposed to be responsible for positive inward currents, while positive BZ supposed to be connected with negative IEF. In my previous movie I explained that it doesn't work that way. Of course, I'm just an amateur and probably I'm not in the position to correct someone with proper education in this field. However, according to my observations, direction of electric currents in the magnetosphere seems to be dictated by the BY east-west orientation of the IMF, what fits nicely to the previous publication. BY and BX components define the orientation of IMF sectors. This allows me to guess that shifts of BX component have as well a direct effect on the atmosphere, but I still need to research it further. BZ IMF component is the most important one when it comes to geomagnetic activity. When the IMF is oriented anti-parallel to geomagnetic field, negative southward BZ, Earth experiences a geomagnetic storm. Energy is being transferred between magnetosphere and IMF, and we can observe beautiful auroras in polar regions. However, when the IMF is oriented northward, positive BZ, connection with geomagnetic field is not possible and magnetosphere behaves like a resistor, instead of a conductor. This increases the pressure of solar wind plasma and causes the discharge of energy stored within the inner magnetosphere. In shortcut, BZ component acts like an on-off switch in the process of energy transfer between Earth and IMF. Positive BZ means that there is no exchange, while negative one means that there is an active transfer of particles. Of course, the bigger is the magnitude of BZ, the stronger is the effect. Southward IMF means very weak electric potentials in the ionosphere, while northward orientation means strong electric charge. But it's the By and Bx components which decide what is the direction of current, and the balance between inflow and outflow of particles. Keep in mind that Bx and By components define the orientation of IMF sectors. This fits perfectly to the correlation between atmospheric vorticity and sectors' boundary crossings. Vorticity is reduced as electric currents change their directions after Earth passed to a sector with opposite polarity. When the value of Bz is neutral, IMF field lines are perpendicular to the orientation of geomagnetic field, and connection with the magnetosphere takes place on the equatorial plane. Such connection pulls the open magnetospheric field lines to lower latitudes. And this explains the correlation between the IMF By component and atmospheric pressure in tropical regions. I want to end discussing the theoretical background of my model with a simple scientific fact, which proves the correlation between geomagnetic field and atmospheric currents. Most of you probably didn't know that oxygen has quite strong paramagnetic properties, which are strong enough to levitate liquid oxygen with a magnet. The air which we use to breathe contains around 20% of oxygen, so it's pretty obvious that it has to be affected by geomagnetic activities. And now is the time to turn this theory into practice. I'm aware that graphs and statistics might appear to be something virtual and completely meaningless. However, you need to realize that all those scientific terms and values are only a translation of things and processes which are just as real and physical as the atmosphere of Earth and the weather which we experience in our everyday life. Even if we can't see the geomagnetic field or feel the gusts of solar wind, it doesn't mean that the environment of interplanetary space is less physical than the world which we observe on the surface of Earth. Most of people think that the magnetic field lines are not real, but the fact is that they occupy exactly the same three-dimensional space as all physical objects, while their size and location can be easily determined by observing their influence on physical matter. To be honest, the importance of magnetic fields is very often understated by people who consider themselves actual scientists. For example, according to some official sources, IMF is frozen in the solar wind plasma, while heliospheric field lines are being carried by solar particles. Another example is the electric universe theory, according to which there is no such process as magnetic reconnection. In this concept, all magnetic fields in space are created by different electric currents during a process known as electromagnetic induction. In the EU model, electric charge is the only factor which actually matters in the space environment, while magnetism is just a simple byproduct of plasma currents. I know that some of you assumed that I'm a supporter of electric universe theory. Sorry to disappoint you. Even if I agree with the main concept of plasma cosmology, there are still many aspects of the EU model which I consider incorrect. I think that the main problem of space science as a whole is the lack of understanding when it comes to magnets and magnetic fields. I will try to deal with this issue with a different movie, as this subject needs a much deeper explanation. For now, all you need to know is the fact that the magnetic polarity and electric charge are two different aspects of physical matter, and both are equally important when it comes to plasma physics and space weather. Magnetic and electric fields can be combined and create a single and dynamic field by electromagnetic induction, but they can also exist as separate and static fields which don't interact with each other at all, and affect the environment in different, although similar ways. If you don't believe me, you can take a compass and check if the needle will be somehow affected by an electrostatic field. Of course, you can also believe me if I tell you that there won't be any effect at all. If you want to make an electric compass, you need to make the needle using aluminium foil. What will make it immune to magnetic fields? But let's move back to plasma physics, as I would like to give you the final answer to the argument between officially approved science and electric universe supporters. Here's the problem. Is the interplanetary magnetic field frozen in solar wind particles, or is it just a byproduct of plasma currents which are being constantly emitted from the sun? And the answer is, I'm sorry, but both explanations are incorrect. You can now shake your hands and drink some beer. Finally, you found yourself in the same position. Magnetic fields don't need any kind of physical matter to be a carrier of the magnetic force. Field lines of two magnets can reconnect even in a hypothetical vacuum. There are connections between galactic magnetic fields even if density of matter in the intergalactic medium is close to zero. On the other hand, if we'll look at the correlation between magnetic fields in space and the motion of particles in a current, it will become absolutely obvious that magnetic fields act in space like highways for the plasma. Energetic particles which create a current are clearly spiraling around magnetic field lines and not the other way around. This shows clearly that magnetic fields have the priority over electric currents. Electric current, which is the source of a magnetic field, can't be affected by this field. Electromagnetic induction creates a secondary field which has lower priority than its source. Besides, electromagnetic induction works in both ways, and an electric current is being created by the motion of a permanent magnet close to a conductor. Relationships between magnetic and electric fields in a conducting medium are explained by a branch of physics called magnetohydrodynamics, MHD. Although it sounds pretty scary, it is probably the best and the easiest way to understand the behavior of plasma in space. Although 95% of common people never heard about such thing, MHD is the only part of space physics which actually works and explains a lot of things without using any hypothetical factors and values, like dark matter, dark energy, and all the other things which scientists had to make up to fill all the giant holes in the mechanism of standard model. And the best part is that you can learn about the MHD with fun. Take a bowl filled with water with a bit of salt, a permanent magnet, a battery, and two wires. Place the magnet in the bowl, connect wires to the battery, and put them into the water. Hydrolysis, which takes place in the presence of a magnetic field, causes the water to spin in opposite directions around the electrodes. And this simple experiment explains most of the mechanisms which are used in MHD. As you can probably guess, my model is also based on the MHD and uses only well-known laws of electromagnetism. On the left side of the screen you can see the basic mechanism which I use in my model to explain the interactions between the environments of space and the atmosphere. Red lines represent open geomagnetic field lines, which connect the magnetosphere to the IMF and allow the transfer of energy between our planet and the heliosphere. Blue and yellow lines represent the currents which are spiraling around the magnetic field lines, exactly as I said couple minutes ago. But here things get slightly more complicated, as the laws of electromagnetism tell that a current has to create a closed loop to allow the transfer of charge between opposite potentials. This is why in all currents energy flows in both directions simultaneously, until the entire differential won't be nullified and reach the neutral state. Electric currents, which we use in everyday life to work with countless devices and power up the entire civilization, are created only by negatively charged electrons. But currents which are being used by the nature to power up the universe are created by particles with both positive and negative charges. Currents with opposite charges spin around the magnetic field lines in opposite directions. Each such configuration of a geomagnetic field line with oppositely directed currents creates a single and dynamic electromagnetic connection between two fields with an energy differential. You can think about such connection as about a cable which contains two wires and a magnetic field line holding them together. Orientation of such connection is defined by the balance of energy which is being transferred by the opposing currents. If the inflow of energy is bigger than the outflow, its orientation is positive. If the outward current is stronger, electromagnetic connection has negative orientation. In scientific language, such process is known as flux transfer event, FTE, while flux tube is a correct term to describe the electromagnetic cable. Be careful to not mistake the orientation with the electric charge. For example, a negatively oriented FTE can be responsible for the outflow of positively charged particles, while a positively oriented current can cause an inflow of negatively charged electrons. Well, what did you expect? It's space science, so it can't be too easy. But maybe it will be easier for you if I will tell that you can try to identify the orientation of a current by observing the behavior of air masses at changes of the cloud cover around the area of an active connection. However, in many cases it might be hard, as there can be only a small imbalance between the inflow and outflow of energy. For example, in this case I can only guess that we deal with an FTE which is oriented slightly positive, as the incoming current seems to be stronger than the negative ones. But over the south polar cap we can see a current with a strong negative orientation, as it seems to suck the tropical air masses from a huge area over the southern Atlantic. Of course, I might be wrong, as I developed this method just a couple hours ago and I'm still learning how to make it correctly. Okay, let's go further. In the difference to dynamic currents, all magnetic field lines have always the same orientation, which can be affected only by the physical migration of geomagnetic poles. But of course, this process is not as rapid as changes in the directions and intensities of electric currents. As I said earlier, magnetic field lines have priority over the electric fields and are not affected by the distribution of electric potentials or by the transfer of energy between them. However, magnetic field lines are strongly affected by the shifts of magnetic orientation in the interplanetary field, during which connection between geomagnetic field and IMF is being reconfigured. In this process, open magnetospheric field lines can be pulled towards lower geographic latitudes or close itself and become connected to Earth on both sides. Of course, an opposite process is possible as well, and a closed field line can be ripped apart and become an open one. On the other hand, charged particles are being strongly affected by the magnetic fields just as by the electric potentials. Electric current which is passing through a magnetic field will change its direction because of the perpendicularly oriented Lorentz force. This is the force responsible for the helical motion of particles along magnetic field lines. But it's the difference of electric potentials which causes the flow of a current. The bigger is the difference between charges, the stronger is the electric field. But in the difference to magnetic fields, electric charge is getting weaker during the transfer of energy between potentials. Of course, this is just the most basic knowledge which we learn on physics lessons, but now it might get harder. Just as the magnetosphere connects itself to IMF because of the attraction between field lines with opposite polarity, so the electric fields connect with each other because of the attraction between opposite potentials. However, in the difference to electrostatic field, reconnections between magnetic field lines do not cause any transfer of energy. Without the electric charge, fields will remain static. Both kinds of static fields can interact with another field of the same type through most of materials and in the vacuum. However, there seems to be no interaction between magnetic and electrostatic field lines. Both fields have as well different properties and affect the environment in a different way. Electrostatic field exists because of the electric charge of a subatomic particle, while its quantum spin is the source of the magnetism. Don't listen to people who say that magnetic field is just an effect of electromagnetic induction. But maybe instead of talking, allow me to turn my boring explanation into a much more meaningful image. I think that there is no sense to explain what is being presented on this handmade visualization. Just some 4 hours ago, I've told you that I'm still learning to identify current orientations. Well, I've learned it already. Weather couldn't be more electromagnetic. This is why I like MHD so much. How can't you like science when you don't need any equations or abstract hypotheses to master heliophysics? Physics is about the beautiful nature, and not about math. Universe is not that complicated. Problem is with the science and not with universe. Scientists make theories which try to explain the universe using 11 different dimensions, instead to fully understand 3 of them. I need to discuss the last aspect of electromagnetic weather, the ionosphere. Ionosphere is the last layer of our defense against solar radiation. Neutral particles are being ionized by the solar radiation and form a kind of electromagnetic bubble which separates the neutral part of atmosphere from the space environment. Without the ionosphere, plasma from the solar wind would reach the surface of Earth and we would be dead. Energetic particles in the upper atmosphere create a protective layer which cuts out all electric currents, so there is no direct exchange of energy between the surface and interplanetary electric field. But it doesn't mean that there is no interaction between them. Geomagnetic and electrostatic field lines pass through ionosphere and direct the currents on both sides. This causes the build-up of energy in the areas where field lines pass through the ionized layer of atmosphere. Opposite potentials start to grow on opposite sides of the ionospheric surface and create a physical pressure on the atmosphere. This process can be seen on the animations above. Of course, this process can be observed as well on meteorological charts as differential of temperature in different layers of atmosphere. Here you can see the influence of two FTEs with opposite direction of currents. This image explains the details of this process. Opposite pressure systems start to grow for currents with opposite directions due to the temperature differentials between lower and upper atmosphere. Negative currents which suck out the energy from Earth's environment are responsible for low pressure systems, while positive ones cause the increase of atmospheric pressure. Eventually, when the differential will be high enough, negative current will form a plume in the ionosphere, which will rip off a piece of atmosphere and transfer it into space in the form of a plasma bubble, plasmoid. Outflow of plasma can be seen often on SWMF magnetosphere monitors. Those who saw my last 2 movies should know already that this process is nicely explained on the ESA site in an article called The Curious Case of Leaking Atmosphere. We can learn here as well that the plasma plumes can be observed when IMF BZ is negative, oriented south, while positive BZ causes weaker but steady leaks from atmosphere. Of course, if you remember what I told you about the BZ component being responsible for the strength of electric currents, this article will make full sense. And this is generally the entire mechanism of interactions between the space environment and the atmosphere. Of course, there are still many details which need to be explained, like the process responsible for cloud formation due to the influence of negative atmospheric currents, which I can't explain at this moment, but maybe I leave it for others, who might want to develop this model in the future. As I said in the beginning of this movie, my model is fully consistent with our current knowledge, and it's hard to consider it as a theory. I'm sure that there shouldn't be any problems to turn it into a computer algorithm which will be able to analyze the data and create a graphical interpretation of geomagnetic field which will be much more detailed than the one which was hand-drawn by me. For the end, I would like to ask you for a favor. If you follow my channel for some time, you should know probably that I've tried many times to make a contact with different scientific institutions and hear what they can say about my research. However, as I said earlier, the world of science remains silent and simply ignores all my emails. Maybe because my model can cause a revolution in our understanding of climate and heliophysics. This is why I need your help. If you care for the future of science and if you want to change something about the reality in which we live, please share this video with as many people as you can. I'm not capable to make everything by myself and I need your support. This movie has the force to shake the world as we know. Even a single stone can cause an avalanche, and it can be your stone. Please, stop being passive and help me to make some changes. And with such proclamation, I will finish this lesson. I hope that you managed to follow my explanations and you understood the mechanism of my model. If not, then don't be afraid to ask. I will try to respond to all your questions in the comment section. And now, class is finally dismissed.